It's a real joy, a real blessing really to be with you. And we gather at a very important time. We gather to remember the many whose names appear on the crosses, the many whose names do not appear, but known perhaps only to their family members in places like El Salvador and Guatemala, Colombia, and other countries who are the victims of violence, who are the victims of the brutality of a school down in Georgia that has caused untold suffering and death to sisters and brothers of Latin America. We gather also to remember the many who are dying as a result of the war in Iraq. What can be more important for us to come together this evening in the name of peace, to express our solidarity with others who are the victims of war and violence and U.S. foreign policy. There cannot be anything more important at this time. It took me a long time to get on that road to peace. I think it's a common experience for most of us. We need others to help us. We need experiences to awaken us. But coming out of a small town in Louisiana, I went to the state university. I worked hard at a degree in geology, wanting to get rich in the oil fields of Venezuela. After college, Vietnam was on. Our leaders used the same language toward Vietnam as they used in Iraq. They said, we had to go off to this country to be the liberators. Our cause was going to be very noble. And I and many believed them. We were so trusting. But something happened in Vietnam as it's happening to us now in Iraq. We are simply not made for the business of war. We cannot go about the business of killing and go on with our lives as before. I thought of making the military a career, and for that reason, in my 4th year, went off to Vietnam. And like so many, was changed by that experience, the violence there, the death, losing friends wounded there. I was forced to, for the first time, to question things, to go deeper into my own heart, and to try and find out what was really, really important in life. I lost my hope there as we are losing hope in Iraq. That's what war does. It destroys our hope. It kills joy. I didn't know I had an option when I went to Vietnam. No one had challenged me. And that's why today when I go into high schools and colleges, just returned from a talk there at Seattle University, being with the Jesuit students, I feel a responsibility to say, especially to students who are being approached by our recruiters today, they have a choice. We must think very, very seriously about a cause when someone tells us that we have to go off to a war, knowing that we may be expected to kill another human being. A basic question, can we do that? Can we take the life of another? Are we prepared to give our lives for that cause, knowing that our loved ones, our family members, friends will grieve for us for many, many years? Their lives will forever be changed. Are we prepared to put them through that? And are we prepared to go off to this war when those who declare the war and use the macho talk about being strong and sacrificing will not go to that war, nor will their sons and daughters go? I think it's very important that we say this to our youth today, that they have an option. We can say no. And to use mottos such as Camilo Mejia, who went to Iraq for a year, came back, and he had to go for another tour, and he said, no, I've seen too much suffering and death. I will not go back to that war. I will go to prison before I go back. And he was court-martialed and sent to prison for a year. And we communicated during his year in prison, and he said it took more courage to go to prison than it did to go off to this war in Iraq. And just the other night, I met with Catherine Shushinsky, 23-year-old soldier at Fort Benning from Texas. She was going through her weapons training at Fort Benning and getting ready to go with her unit to Iraq. And she thought about that when she was on that firing range with her M16, that basic question, can I kill another human being? And she came to the conclusion, no, I cannot do this. She's informed her commanding officer at Fort Benning she will not go, and she will be court-martialed soon. And she, like Camilo and others, are prepared to go to prison. These are models for us today. People who can give us hope and inspiration, and I think we ought to let others know about them. I came back from Vietnam wanting to find hope again. I wanted to be a peacemaker. I entered the Marino community, having met a missionary in Vietnam who was a big influence on my life. Marino, I learned, was a group that was working in 28 countries around the world, serving the poor. And I came home and was just so happy to be back with family and friends in Louisiana. And then went off to these seminaries out east, finally ordained and assigned now to our missions in Bolivia, where the poor of Bolivia became my teachers. And this is the way it works when we put our feet in the culture of another, especially the poor, the oppressed. They will teach us so much if only we're open. Most of the people of Bolivia, as throughout the developing world today, live on the edge. They struggle for survival. They're in the shacks without the running water. They don't have schools for their kids. When they're sick, there's not those medicines to get to be healed. And they will die so often before 4 or 5 years old. Bolivia was under a brutal dictator. General Hugo Banzer came into power through a violent coup. And it angered me, it saddened me to see my country in Bolivia supporting General Banzer and the men with the guns who were defending that system that kept the rich rich and the poor poor. And the big corporations were coming in, as we read about today. Thanks, Rich. There are huge profits to be made in the developing countries today from the cheap labor. New York Times today, they're talking about the sweatshops in El Salvador, in Jordan, Bangladesh, where workers put in 20-hour days. They're paid less than $50 a month. You can't get away with that here in Seattle and other parts of the country. We have what we call the minimum wage laws. But in Latin America and throughout the developing world, you can exploit that cheap labor and the vast resources there where there are huge profits to be made. What happens in a country like Bolivia and any other country where the poor are oppressed, they come together as we would come together and say, basta, enough. We begin to organize. We begin to talk about freedom from our oppression, land reform, schools, hospitals, a living wage. And this is what this struggle really is all about. When the poor gather like that, it's dangerous. Many are killed, many are forced to flee their country, many imprisoned. It was in my 5th year, I was leaving a meeting at the university with a group of Bolivians, and we were arrested. I was forced to leave the country could not return. It was a very difficult time in my journey. I was not allowed to return to Bolivia, denied a visa. But then something happened. My attention turned to El Salvador. Archbishop Oscar Romero drew us to this little country when he was assassinated while saying Mass way back in 1980. Why was he killed? Because he dared to speak out for those, he said, whose voices were being taken away, who didn't have a voice often, the powerless. Shortly after, just months after he was assassinated, 4 churchwomen from our country who went to El Salvador at his invitation were raped and killed. Two of them were Marino's sisters who were friends, Maura Clark and Eda Ford. With them was Dorothy Kazel from Cleveland and lay Missioner Jean Donovan. When that happened, it really brought El Salvador very close to us. Many of us went there to try and find out what was going on. And what we found, of course, was this microcosm of Latin America. But in El Salvador, it was really the worst we had seen. I personally was more frightened in El Salvador than I was in Vietnam or Bolivia. I have never seen such brutality of a military toward their people. They had the guns, and there were no limits to what they were doing. 14 families ended up with 60% of the land. What angered us also when we were there as North Americans was to see, once again, our country deeply involved, giving guns and training to those doing the killing. And really, that was a crime against humanity. And many of us came back home, and we couldn't shut up. It was all being done in our name with our tax money. Not long after coming back from El Salvador on a speaking tour, we read in the front pages of our papers about 525 soldiers arriving at Fort Benning, Georgia, to start their combat training here in our backyard. And friends went there to say simply, not in our name. We went there to protest. We gave talks in different universities and high schools there, a few churches, anyone who would open their doors to us. Then we decided to take the message to the Salvadoran soldiers on Fort Benning, who were being trained in the art of killing. And our little group of 3 who decided to do this action was Linda Ventimiglia, who was in the Army Reserves, who had trained at Fort Benning. Larry Rosebaum, an oblate priest who had just come back from his work in Brazil. And we went down to this Army surplus place, Ranger Joe's. We bought these Army uniforms. A few nights later, we entered Fort Benning dressed as high-ranking Army officers. We had with us this powerful boombox, and in it was the last sermon of Bishop Romero that he gave in the cathedral the day before he was assassinated, where he made his special plea to the men in the military, saying to them, stop the killing. Lay down your weapons. Disobey your superior officers telling you to kill your fellow campesinos. And obey a higher law, that law of God that says, thou shalt not kill. Bishop Romero, I must say, was special. Although he was so much like us, he was not known for his boldness, his courage, his wisdom. He was considered a bookworm. He was very silent. Probably that's why they made him bishop. But something happened to this very shy, humble priest who became the bishop of San Salvador, he began to see close up what was happening to his people. They were being slaughtered, disappeared. And he said, I have a responsibility. I've got to speak out. I have a voice and I've got to use it. And he did just that. It wasn't complicated. He had to speak for those who were being killed, whose voices were being taken away. And he knew the consequences. His friends were saying to him, Oscar, you've got to leave the country. You're going to be killed. He was getting a lot of death threats. And he said, no, I've got to stay. I've got to stay. Knowing, of course, what was going to happen. And it was the day after his special plea to the military to lay down their weapons to stop the killing that he was in church saying Mass and was killed by this assassin's bullet. Before he was killed, he did say that they could kill me, but I will live on in the lives of the pueblo and the lives of others. And how true it is. The martyrs, they do that to us. They stretch us. They give us the courage we normally wouldn't have. And that night, Bishop Romero gave us the courage we needed to accomplish our mission, to take to the soldiers on Fort Benning his last sermon one more time. We penetrated this high security area with that boom box and his last sermon in that tape player. Got saluted. Went near the barracks where the Salvadorans were housed, and with tree climbers we climbed this tall pine and waited. And about 11 o'clock at night when the last lights went out, we just said, Bishop Romero, this is for you, brother. His voice just boomed into the barracks. And they were pretty upset with us, and not quite sure why, but we saw this as a very sacred moment. They didn't see it that way. They came out of the barracks with their lights, their guns, the dogs, threatened to shoot us down if we didn't come down. It was time to come down. But we left the boom box up there, blasting away, his message being repeated. They handcuffed us, started kicking us, punching us. They were pretty angry because we had messed up their training. They took us to the county jail and then to trial before this judge we've come to know well over those years as Maximum Bob. He didn't like protesters, sent civil rights leaders down in Georgia to jail. And in that courtroom were our parents and friends, family members. And we wanted to put our country's foreign policy on trial that day. But we couldn't. Every time we talked about that and mentioned Bishop Romero and the churchwomen and what we were doing in El Salvador, the judge would cut us off. Irrelevant, he said. We were sent to prison for a year and a half. In prison, as many have found, it's difficult. It's noisy. It's hard at times. And but we had no regrets. We learned that they couldn't silence us. The truth can never really be silenced. And we wrote hundreds of letters from prison. And we had media interviews. We tried to expose this issue for what it was, a crime being committed against the people of El Salvador. And when we got out of prison, our hope was intact. The joy was still there. They couldn't kill that. And we joined thousands around the country, many here in the Seattle area, trying to end that military aid, but we couldn't do it. It got up to $1 million a day, and the bloodshed continued. November the 16th, 1989, they went after the Jesuits. As we know, the Jesuits are very influential. They run 28 universities here in the U.S. At their university in El Salvador, there in San Salvador, the UCA, they were very upset with the Jesuits because they were calling it by its right name, idolatry, the worship of these false gods of wealth and power. And they went a step further. They began to identify those individuals and institutions who were worshiping the false gods and doing the killing. And they, like Romero, got the death threats. And they kept their hands on the plow. They didn't look back. They too were told by their friends to leave the country, but they said, like Romero, no, I cannot. And it was after midnight, November the 16th, the army entered their campus and dragged these 6 Jesuits out of their rooms. With them, their co-worker, young mother Elba, and her 15-year-old daughter, Selena. And they were shot at close range. They were massacred. And this hit the front pages of our newspapers the next day, and it angered so many people, including many many members of Congress, some of them educated by the Jesuits. All of a sudden, El Salvador comes much closer. They send a congressional task force to El Salvador to investigate. They come back reporting that those who did the killing were trained in the United States, in our backyard, at a big school down in Georgia called Fort Benning, at a school called the U.S. Army School of the Americas. When I and friends who had been in Latin America read this, to be honest, we knew very little about this school and felt it was very, very important that we investigate. I left early from my assignment with Marinol in Minnesota. I thought it was time to leave my work there, and with the blessing and support of my community, went down to Georgia, and right outside of the main gate, I found this little apartment. A soldier had just been transferred, rent $175 a month. Beat Seattle, I tell you. This became our SOA watch, really, but we had no ideas or vision of a movement. Friends started to come into town. Kathy Kelly came in from Chicago. Many of you know Kathy. Went on to co-found Voices in the Wilderness, who actually today is back in Iraq. We remember her. Charlie Litke came in from San Francisco, a Vietnam veteran, recipient of the Medal of Honor. A Jesuit came in from Boston, 2 Dominicans, 3 Salvadorans who had to flee their country with death threats, students from their university. And we came together for a 3-day retreat to reflect, what are we going to do? On one of those nights, we went out to this nice Mexican restaurant, and we talked about a fast. One thing I've learned is never plan a fast while at a restaurant. It seems like such a good idea at the time. So we're going to start this fast, open-ended, 1 day at a time, a water-only fast. Now, I had suggested sort of like a beans and rice fast. So the next day we're camping out at the main gate to try and expose this issue through a fast, knowing that our fast, of course, was temporary, voluntary. It could be ended at any time, and we were fasting in solidarity with so many people in our world whose fast is not voluntary, whose fast is mandatory. They cannot end their fast as we could. We went 35 days. Our bodies grew weak, but the spirit remained strong. And we started to have a crowd that would gather each day around 5 o'clock. From the community, soldiers sometimes would join us to pray, reflect, have a little music, poetry. And there was a lot of good community built during those days. After the fast, we had to get to work. We had research to do. We knew so little about this school. And what we learned through the Freedom of Information Act, and helped along by members of Congress and Amnesty International, that this school had been around for a long time, since the 1940s. It had trained over 50,000 soldiers from Latin America. They came here to learn how to be commandos. They learned psychological warfare. and counterinsurgency. Who were the insurgents? That was the basic question we had. And what we learned as we did our research was that the insurgents were really those who've been the enemy for a long time. The poor, those human rights advocates, religious leaders, healthcare workers, university leaders. They were the targets of those being trained at this school. Many of the graduates went on to become their country's dictators. General Hugo Banzer, not only a graduate, but in 1988 inducted into the school's Hall of Fame, where his photograph was on the wall with 20 other generals presented as model soldiers. And what got the school in big trouble later was these torture manuals. The Pentagon was forced to reveal that at the school in the curriculum were these manuals that advocated torture and executions, kidnappings. When the United Nations Truth Commission report on El Salvador was made public and got a lot of press, it really started to alert people about the seriousness of this issue. It reported that those who killed Bishop Romero trained here. Those who raped and killed the 4 church women were graduates. The 28 who killed the Jesuits and the 2 women, 19 of them graduates. And the list, this was the tip of the iceberg, and the list went on and on and on. And word began to spread all over the country, from Seattle to New York, from Chicago to New Orleans, and people began to pay attention to this in our places of worship, peace organizations. People began to say this is a serious issue. And we started now to gather at the main gate of Fort Benning in November to simply call for this closing of this school that was causing all of this suffering and death in Latin America, being paid, of course, by our taxes. We were complicit in this. It was being done in our name. That first year, our gathering was very small. A handful of us gathered at the main gate. The next year, 100 came, and then 500. The next year, 1,000. Well, this last November, over 19,000 gathered from all over the world, all over the country. When we gather, it's this big celebration of hope. Over half who were there this last year were university students and high school students. A lot of senior citizens are there. The Grandmothers for Peace always with us. A lot of parents with their children, lots of nuns, lots of veterans who see this issue for what it is, bringing shame to our country. But when we all gather from different ages and backgrounds, different parts of the country, some from Latin America, we're there speaking with one voice, and it's really not about us. It's about expressing really our solidarity, our love and support for others who are the victims of our country's foreign policy, knowing very well now that these soldiers simply provide the muscle for U.S. foreign policy in these countries. These soldiers simply protect the economic interest or the watchdogs of these large multinational corporations who are exploiting the resources and the cheap labor of these countries. That Saturday, of course, is a lot of speeches, a lot of good musicians are there to uplift the spirit, the puppetistas are there. Sunday, it's more solemn. We have our funeral procession. And the thousands there, we carry the crosses, the religious symbols with the names of the victims. Some holding the Star of David, the photographs of the victims. And as we process those names, as we saw earlier, those names are called out. And after each name, in unison, we say, presente, this person is with us. And it's here that we're touching on the sacred. It's really liturgy at its finest. Many weep. And this is what happens, I think, when we start touching on the sacred. We weep. And we get to this big fence. This big chain link fence topped with barbed wire. The gates are closed. Signs that say no trespassing. I won't let you know where I got this sign here. But those signs, that fence, they're not to stop us. When we get to that fence, our religious symbols, the photographs, crosses are placed in that fence. And you can't see the other side. We turn it into a memorial wall. Some who gather feel compelled to go over or under the fence. And in the early days, the fence actually was open where we could walk onto the posts by the thousands. But after 2001, security tightened. And it's more difficult to enter Fort Benning. When you go over or under that fence, they say we're trespassing, we're breaking the law. And those who do that are arrested and are brought to trial. I'm happy to say that since our movement began, we have now over 200 who have gone to prison. And this last year, 29 were arrested, and they are now in prison, doing from 2 months to 6 months, some with heavy fines, and we remember them in a special way. Their names and prison addresses can be found on our SOA Watch website, soaw.org. I'm very happy to say that among our prisoners of conscience, Washington State and Oregon have been very well represented. From our area, and we have some of our prisoners of conscience who are with us this evening. Rich Ring is here, Father Bill Bixel, Sister Maureen Neumann, Sister Miriam Spencer. Could you please stand, those who are here? And also, and Patty Inman, who's not with us this evening, Fred Mercy, a Jesuit brother, Vanessa Pustek, Eric Robinson, I don't think they're here with us this evening, and anyone else, I hope I didn't leave out from Washington.
Oh, I'm from Oregon.
Yeah, I wanted to, and from Oregon. And from Oregon we have, let's see, 3, 6, 7, and from Oregon we have Peg Morton with us. Please, Peg, stand. Our prisoners of conscience. When they send us to prison, something happens. It energizes the movement. Their intention in those early days was to hit us with those stiff sentences and big fines. But what happened was when they would send us to prison, many more would come the following November. And the POCs would speak from their prisons. Let me just say that we're not going away. This coming November, we're going to be back. This is the weekend before Thanksgiving. It would be wonderful if more from this area could be with us. I was very happy just before coming here to be speaking at the Jesuit University, where they had 17 of the students who came, and many more said they'll be coming this coming November. We have a bill in Congress, a very important bill, H.R. 1217. We're going to have a vote, it looks like in June, possibly later this month, but it looks like June. We have to work on Representative Jay Inslee and Representative Dave Reinhardt. They are not signed on to this bill yet, and we need them. So your letters are very, very important. You could also connect it to the money involved, along with other issues, but and simply say, we don't want millions of dollars from our taxes going into this school, but we want to direct that to schools for our children. We want to bring that into our own communities to help the poor here, the homeless. We want to direct that to the people of Latin America for schools, hospitals, medicines, books. A sign of hope. It was last year, a little over a year ago, we went to Venezuela to meet with President Chavez. We received a call from a friend there, Lisa Sullivan, a longtime Maryknoll lay missionary, who said she thought she could get us a meeting with President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. Just a few weeks later, a delegation's on a plane going to Caracas. And after spending a week in the barrios, visiting with the people, and finding so much hope there and excitement about all this money, for the first time, millions and millions being directed to the poor from the oil revenues that had never been done before. It always went into the pockets of the CEOs and the oil companies, the stockholders. For the first time, it's going now to the poor. And we had that meeting with President Chavez. We got right to the point. We said, Mr. President, we're here to request that Venezuela would withdraw their troops from this school. It was a very warm meeting for about an hour, but he said he had to consult his ministers and others. And then, so we returned to our work here, and then 3 weeks later we got the official word that Venezuela had made their decision to withdraw immediately all troops from Venezuela from the school. At our next annual strategy meeting, grassroots meeting in Washington, we came up now with a new strategy. We're going to keep doing what we're doing here in the United States. That's so important. Gathering at the main gate of Fort Benning in November, going to Washington to lobby, educating locally, organizing locally in our communities around the country. And then we came up now with what we call our Latin American strategy. We said, let's go to these countries of Latin America and ask them to do what Venezuela did, withdraw their troops from this school. So this last month, our delegation, small group of us, Lisa Sullivan, Carlos Mauricio, many of you know Carlos, survivor of torture from El Salvador, who's very active in our movement, and we went to Bolivia for a week. We went to Argentina for a week and then on to Uruguay. Let me say this, that there is this sea change that's taken place in Latin America. Something incredible is going on there. Each of these countries are very different. Bolivia, the majority are the indigenous, the Aymara and the Quechua. And there they have their first indigenous president, Evo Morales. And there's all this excitement in each of these countries. They have something in common with all of their differences and histories. What they have in common is that this fear that was so alive for so many years, caused by their militaries, this fear is now dead. This fear has been replaced by hope. And for me personally, to go back to Bolivia after all these years and to find that, it was just very, very moving. I remember so well those years in Bolivia, that fear. So many were being arrested, killed, exiled. There were times when we couldn't sleep in our own homes in fear that the knock was going to come on the door. There would be the military to pick up people on that list, the so-called insurgents, the subversives. But to go back now and to find former political prisoners in these high government positions as senators and ministers, it's just incredible. Never once we got together, friends there, and we said, you know, who would have ever thought that this would ever happen? And that's why I think sometimes, you know, we never know what our actions are going to do, the fruit they will bear. We will not see that fruit, I'm sure, this year or next year, or maybe not during our lifetime. But what we do for justice, for peace, for humanity, it is not wasted. It will bear fruit. And this is what we saw there in Bolivia. We met with President Evo Morales at 5 o'clock in the morning. They start their day early there. It was a wonderful meeting. After meeting with human rights leaders, indigenous leaders, we finally, on our last day, were at the Palacio at 4:30 in the morning. And sure enough, he arrived at 5 and 5:15. We're in the office meeting with him. A very cordial meeting. And we briefed him on this issue, and he's going to be meeting with his ministers and the leaders of the country, and we have no doubt that Bolivia will withdraw their troops any day now. Then we went to Argentina and Uruguay, where we met with their defense ministers and many other people. And a day after the meetings with their defense ministers, we were informed officially that Argentina and Uruguay have withdrawn their troops. And it was very heartening during our meetings to be stopped occasionally by the ministers to say, we know this school very well. We have been on the receiving end for many years. We know the well-known graduates from our country who have studied there, who have trained there. And what they're saying is that, like the defense minister of Argentina, in her words, "Esta escuela no debe existir." This school should not exist. And that's the way it is, really. And we came back. We didn't know what kind of response we were going to get when we went to these countries. And I can only say we came back filled with this renewed hope. We felt this joy. It was a marathon. It was very tiring. But we came back just feeling so good. And we feel that this is going to energize our movement because we had such a positive response in these countries. In August, our delegation's going to Chile, we're going to Peru, and we're going to Ecuador. And already we're trying to work out meetings there. We want to, of course, talk with their presidents. We want to get to their defense ministers, the leaders of their grassroots communities there, their peace and justice leaders of their countries. And we feel that here too we will get a positive response. I can only say that we are going to keep our hands on the plow. We're going to keep moving forward. We're going to hold on to our hope and our joy. We believe that we're getting close. We can shut down this school. And when we do, of course, we're going to have a big fiesta down in Georgia. But until then, we're going to keep gathering, and I hope that we will see more folks at the main gate for our big celebration of hope. And lastly, the words of Bishop Romero. I always like to close with his words because he is such an inspiration to so many in our movement and so many in his country. He said before he was assassinated, let those who have a voice speak for the voiceless. Speak for those whose voices have been taken away. Speak for peace. And that's where we come in. We've got a voice, you and I. We have a voice. And it's so important that we use our voices, our energy, our gifts that we all have, that we use that as clearly and boldly as we possibly can today. Thank you. This is a serious issue, this police academy that's gotten the approval evidently by their Congress in El Salvador. Condoleezza Rice has made some comments about the importance of this school. Many see this school as really a preparation for a new SOA or WINSEC being established when this school here at Fort Benning is forced to close. It's a very serious issue. It's basically the same issue at its core, and this is this issue of control and power that's given to the police forces or to the military that will really, in an effective way, help implement U.S. foreign policy there. More and more it's becoming difficult for the United States to hold on to these countries of Latin America simply because of these changes. In today's paper we read about Bolivia. The president there has made a decision to nationalize the natural gas. It's a country very rich in natural gas, and second only to Venezuela. And what's going on in these countries of Latin America is this, that they are distancing themselves from our military, from this school, and they are also disassociating themselves from U.S. economic policies that they have had forced upon them for years, but have come to the conclusion over the last couple of years that our policies, this free trade, and our economic policies that have been forced upon them has brought more poverty in their country than ever. The gap between the rich and the poor of their countries have widened. More of their people are suffering today than ever before. And it's caused them to say no, no, no. And what we heard from the president in Bolivia and from the ministers of these countries we visited is this: our country, the United States, is welcome. We are welcome as a partner, not as before, however. Not as a conquistador, no. We are not welcome as in the past to come to exploit, to live off of the backs of their people. That relationship, they're saying, must be horizontal, not as in the past, vertical. Any relationship between two individuals or two countries that's top-down, where one is dominating the other, will never last. It cannot be sustained over a long period of time. And that period has come to an end. In the United States, I want to say the Bush administration is in a real fix. They really don't know what to do. These countries are simply saying basta, nunca más, nunca más. Or they're going to go back to the days of the past. And so what they're doing, we feel, some of us, is that this police academy in El Salvador is in preparation for the closing of this school of assassins down in Georgia. Well, first, that second question, because it's so important. Why are they define kind of the U.S.? And, it's simply that they have so much experience with U.S. economic policies after so many years, and they're at a point now where they're saying basta. I mean, and again, they're resisting. They are saying that they will no longer go along with the U.S. as before. And they can do it. They can do it. Their militaries still have power, but the militaries are on the sideline. Now in Argentina, we were happy to see the military there in Argentina so disgraced, they will not wear their uniforms in public. They are so disgraced. And they are bringing to trial some of these high-ranking officers who gave themselves impunity. That's the power that they have. And some continue to have, especially in El Salvador, Guatemala, Argentina. They simply gave themselves immunity. You couldn't touch them. Well, what the madres and the abuelas de la Plaza de Mayo, this highly respected group of women who have started protesting years ago, They have so much respect and power in the country now. They're one of the leading organizations that are saying no to impunity. And they're calling for these trials to take place. And what they're saying is this: there can never be healing until there's truth, until there is an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And this is where I want to say the SOA comes in with that name change way back in 2000, when the Pentagon said, we're putting the past behind us. We're now going to start a new chapter. So many survivors of torture and so many families whose loved ones are still disappeared simply said, this is not for you to say when it's time to move on. That will come from us. And what they are calling for in these countries that we visited is this: they want accountability. They want an accounting of the truth of what happened to their loved ones. And they want justice, and they're saying that there can never be this reconciliation and healing until this truth starts coming out. And they're saying, let the healing begin. That's why the SOA is this issue of our bill. It calls in that present H.R. 1217, it calls for the investigation of these hundreds of soldiers who have never been held accountable for their crimes. The IMF and World Bank fits into this big economic picture that they're distancing themselves from. We've got a resource on the back table called SOA Guns and Greed, a couple years old, but very timely, very relevant, 20 minutes. But it shows the connection between this school, its role in the IMF and the World Bank, sort of this free market economy and what it's doing to the people there. One cannot talk about this issue without addressing the economics. And in a way, you don't have to be PhD from the Wharton School in Pennsylvania to understand what's at work here. It's our country that's been really making huge profits from the poor of Latin America and other countries, and have needed this school to provide the power, the muscle, the watchdogs for this to take place. This issue is a big one, of course, and it's connected to bigger issues. Our issue is not in competition with other issues. The immigration issue is connected to this. I was in Des Moines a couple of weeks ago, and 7,000 gathered there at the main center, front of the federal building there. The Latinos, the Latinas, as they gathered all over the country in large numbers, and they held the signs, we are not illegal, no human being is illegal. We are not criminals. One had a sign, I remember, my mother is not a criminal. And so many of our brothers and sisters from Latin America are here because of course, U.S. policies, because of NAFTA and CAFTA. This is what they call blowback. It's connected. It's connected to our economic policies. It's connected to what we have been doing to Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala. It cannot be separated. One thing I think of often is, where do we go from here? What do we do when we shut down this school? We got work ahead of us, needless to say. This school is one expression of, there are many other bases, around the country, around the world. I'm reading this book now, The Sorrow of Empire. We have over 175 military bases outside of the United States where we are training other militaries. What's this about? To sustain empire. This school down in Georgia is part of that system to sustain the empire. We have over 500,000 soldiers and contractors staffing these 175 military bases outside of the U.S. And it all is connected to building of this empire. And needless to say, we've got a lot of work to do. Whether it's immigration, it's the war in Iraq, it's the war we prepare now for in Iran. It's right here in our backyard, the discrimination that we see so alive in our communities. We've got work to do. When it comes to this school, and I want to say this, all of these issues that we're working on, we're not in competition with each other. We're connected. It's all under this umbrella of peace and justice, of hope and love and joy, that we're all one in this. We're all in this circle together. But I've got this little plaque in my office that says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall never be unemployed." We've got a lot of work ahead of us. I want to say this. We've got, when we leave, I think we've got a reception. I don't want to hold us up for the reception there. We can continue to visit. Be great to talk some more informally over some refreshments downstairs. In the back, when you leave and downstairs, we've got resources. That video I mentioned, SOA Guns and Greed, connected to the bigger economic issues. From warriors to resistors, Vietnam vets, Iraqi vets, who are basically, in a short story, telling their story briefly, how they went from warriors to resistors, why they're working for peace, why they're against the war in Iraq, why they're working on this issue. And Disturbing the Peace in the back, a lot of my own journey, a lot about the movement, and a lot more in-depth material about U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. I want to thank Greg Speltz in a special way, the coordinator of the SOA Watch Group here, along with Kate and really everyone for all the hard work, the warm hospitality of the parish here, and the pastor who opened up the church to us. And I just want to thank really each of you for taking the time to come. It's just such a joy to be back. I was here a few years ago. It's just great to be back. And I just ask that we just keep moving ahead, trying to do what we can, to be peacemakers in our world. But thank you for all the good work that you do here for peace. Thank you.